my channel, Sprouts with Joy. My name is Joy. I'm so glad that you're here. We're going to be talking about lots of planty things on this channel, so if you like this content, please consider liking and subscribing for more. All right, let's get into the video. So today we're going to be getting a little bit vulnerable and talking about some of the mistakes that I made as a beginner plant parent. Yeah, I know. Now, nobody's perfect, nobody really fully arrives, but I definitely have improved substantially in my plant knowledge compared to the time when I began, which honestly, that's the way that you want it to be. You want to be growing all the time, right? As a person and as a plant parent. So yeah, we're gonna be talking about that fun topic. And I'm hoping that either I'll make you feel better about the mistakes that you used to make as a beginner plant parent, or if you are a beginner plant parent, hopefully I can help you to avoid some of these nasty mistakes that have killed some of my plants or have just done them harm or made them not thrive quite as much as they would if I hadn't made these mistakes. So I would say the very first general category would be plant placement errors. I did not always research a plant and what it would actually need. I generally just put a plant where I thought it would be aesthetically pleasing, which honestly, I mean, it's fine. I think that a lot of my plants are not in a perfectly ideal location, but that's also because my home is not a rainforest. I'm limited by the window space that I have, and I just make do with what I have. There's a balance that you're trying to strike between having an appealing interior space and a space that is perfect for your plants, because sometimes the perfect spot for a plant would not look that great in reality in your decorative space. I'm a huge advocate for just living with your plants and living among your plants. You want them to be in a spot that is convenient for you and that looks nice. But of course, you also want to take into account their needs. And for a while, I just didn't really think about it for some reason, because I was mostly thinking about plants as decoration. I would say doing your research before you bring a plant home is imperative. You need to know if you even have an environment that can accommodate that plant, because some plants are going to be much more sensitive to lighting and to humidity than other plants, and you just have to keep in mind, okay, do I have a good spot for this? Do I even have the space for this? Those are some good questions that you should be asking yourself before you even bring a plant home. I also definitely put some plants way too close to a south-facing window a couple of times, and they have little tiny scorch marks on their leaves now, which is really sad, but you also have to keep in mind the types of leaves that they have. So plants with thinner leaves are going to be more likely to be scorched. Like I had a golden pothos and a white star calathea right up next to the south-facing window. It's where they looked nice, and you know, it only took maybe a week before I noticed that they were scorched, and I was like, oh, you poor things, and I moved them. But yeah, I mean, it can take its toll on a plant, and I don't think it'll permanently damage it. It's more cosmetic than anything, but it's still not great for the plant. I think another factor to this was that I grew up in South Florida, where we're very close to the equator, so I didn't have much of a concept of north-facing windows are different from south-facing windows, and east and west have different intensities of light to them and different, you know, obviously I knew the sun rose in the east and set in the west, but when you're that close to the equator, the difference is not quite as marked as it would be in the Midwest. So I'd say that's another thing to keep in mind is your zone and the way that the light falls into your home. That makes a really big difference. I think it's important to observe your environment and the way that the humidity is and the sun and all of those lovely factors you have to just observe for yourself. There's only so much you can read online about your space because it's your unique space. As a beginner plant parent, I also went through a phase of, oh wow, I haven't been giving these plants enough light and they've just been really sad. So a few years ago, I had an apartment that didn't have that many windows and I didn't have very great places for plants. So I just did my best to cope with it, but especially during the winter time, I could tell they were just suffering. So as soon as it was warm enough, I was like, okay, we're gonna do some emergency room plant hospitalization. So silly me, I just took all my plants and stuck them outside in full sun, like every day for like a month. Like every afternoon that it was sunny, I just was like, okay, they need to recover from the winter time. Let's stick them all outside and just let them, immediately. And I also burned some plants that way because they were very shocked to just go from dark, gloomy space to huzzah, full sun. So I did that for a while. I thought that they would like it and that it would be the equivalent of maybe an IV into someone that's dehydrated. Like, okay, you need fluids ASAP. And I mean, you have to wait for your plant to acclimatize to its environment. Otherwise it will get shocked. And I did learn that the hard way. I did not prefer that. You would think that they would, but they just didn't. Another mistake that I made when it came to placement was not heating drafts and AC vents, or they're also the heating vents. So I had a few plants that they weren't doing well, and I was like, why aren't you doing well? I'm giving you good light and I'm giving you enough water, and it's like, what is going on with you? Why are you so droopy? And then I realized, oh wow, every time the AC comes on or the heating comes on, you just get a blast of air. Or, oh, you're right next to a door, so during the winter time when that door opens, it's just like whew. And some plants are more tolerant of it than others, but definitely if your plant is having some issues, pay attention to drafts that might be interfering with your plant's happiness. So getting into potting your plants, first of all, I, for a very long time, would just use straight houseplant potting soil, or straight, at least for my succulents, I used the cactus mix that you got, but it still needed a lot more additives and drainage to help it out. Really, it's important for the roots to get air and for the soil to be nice and aerated. And if you have straight potting soil, it has a tendency to get really compacted, and also, so the roots aren't getting enough air, it's going to be more prone to root rot, and the soil is not going to dry out fast enough for a lot of plants. Obviously, some plants are okay with being moist, or in fact, they prefer being moist, and in that case, you adjust the ratio of what's in your soil accordingly. But a lot of plants really need a lot of soil additives to make the soil more rich with nutrition, less dense, and more aerated, so that it doesn't compact and drown those roots and suffocate those roots. So some examples of soil additives that you could add would be orchid bark is a really good one. Perlite is a pretty popular one that people use, although I have heard that it can be annoying sometimes. Pumice is another good one, or even just little pebbles you could use in theory. It's very similar. Cocoa peat is another one, and sometimes people will add in some organic fertilizer to their soil and kind of mix it in there. Even something like worm castings or fish emulsion could be mixed in there, and it would give a lot of extra nutrition to that soil. Another factor related to potting is drainage. So I would go to the store as a beginner plant parent. I would see all of these really pretty pots that I liked, and sometimes I would even go for something that was not traditionally pot, like even like a metal bucket, which did not work well, sorry. It just did not work well. Or like wooden things, which obviously would end up rotting and was awful. So I was attracted to a lot of things that were not actually pots, even like a mason jar I've used once. And I had read up online, hey, it's important for your plants to have drainage. So you know what you can do if you don't have a drainage hole? You can add rocks to the bottom. That's what I had read online. And that is a myth that is very pervasive even today. So yeah, I made a habit of doing that with a lot of my plants because I had a lot of pots that didn't have drainage, and I either didn't think to use the nursery pots that they came with, or I just didn't have them on hand. So I was just like, oh, well, what's the worst that could happen? Rot is the worst that can happen. You don't want rot. So yeah, it just wasn't great. So I put rocks in the bottom, and part of the issue is the water that you water your plants with, especially if you're watering them thoroughly and properly, which I'll get to that in a minute. I think the reason that a lot of my plants actually kind of survived for a while with rocks at the bottom, or because I wasn't actually watering them properly. They were suffering in more ways than one. But if you're watering your plants thoroughly, there isn't really anywhere for that water to go. And when you just have rocks at the bottom, the water isn't really evaporating out. It's all just kind of gathering at the bottom, and it's raising the water table. So the roots are reaching down for that water, and then it's icky water, and they're just gonna be sitting in water and kind of have their feet wet, so to speak, and they're not gonna be happy. Now, admittedly, I still have 2 plants that are in situations like this that I have not repotted yet, just because I haven't gotten around to it, and you know, they're doing okay. I'm very careful when I water them. There is a way that you can do it, but it's annoying. So I'll pour in the water, and then I'll kind of tip it out a little bit and catch the soil in my hands to try to get as much excess water out as possible. It's easy enough to do, but why don't you just plant them in a pot with drainage and you don't have to worry about it? Or you know, if you don't have any nursery pots, or you really don't want to use a nursery pot with a cash po or a cover pot, you can plant it in terracotta, which is my personal favorite. Or you could drill a hole in the bottom, which with some pots I've learned it's easier than with others. And there are lots of methods that you can find online to do it. It's kind of a headache though to me personally, so I'd rather just stick with nursery pots and put them in cash pose, or use terracotta. That's just the easiest way to do it in my opinion. I also definitely potted some plants into pots that were way too big, thinking, oh, well, they'll grow into it, right? No, I would say, again, you're at risk for root rot because you have a lot of soil and a lot of moisture that the roots cannot soak up, and they get really overwhelmed. So that's another one I've learned the hard way. And also, a lot of plants prefer to be a little bit more root bound anyways, like pothos and Hoya as a general rule. So I tend to hold off on, you know, sizing up the pot. And obviously there is a time when you really need to repot your plant, but only go up by like an inch or 2 max, and they'll be much happier for it. Now, getting into the watering arena, the only thing I really have to say about watering is, honestly, thorough watering is best, and there are a lot of methods. You can water in place and then dump out the excess water that drains out, you know, from your nursery pot into the cover pot, or from your terracotta pot into a dish. Or what I tend to do is just take all of my plants to the sink or to the tub and just water them thoroughly there. And really what you're doing when you're watering thoroughly is you're promoting a healthy root system, because if you have water that's just going all the way through the entirety of the pot, entirety of the soil, the roots will learn to chase after that water and become much more robust in their growth. Whereas if you're just giving your plant a few teensy tiny drops here and there that like go down, you know, maybe only a few inches of the entire pot, the roots aren't going to be chasing after the water and growing long and that sort of thing. They're really just you're gonna have a very shallow and weak root system as a result of that. So watering thoroughly is definitely your best bet. I would say the next mistake I made was just never fertilizing my plants, ever. this was something that I just completely overlooked for some reason. I associated fertilizing with outdoor plants and not with indoor house plants. And I knew a lot about composting and plant nutrition because I gardened with my parents as a kid, but again, I just didn't really think, oh, I really need to replenish the nutrients that are in this tiny pot of soil. There's a lot that you can get into when it comes to fertilizer. And so I might link a few videos below that I found because other people that know a lot more than I do have made videos about it, so you may as well just watch those to get the extent of it. But I just want to be the person to tell you, please fertilize your plants. I would say the general rule of thumb is less fertilizer is better than too much fertilizer, because too much fertilizer does have the risk of burning your plants. So I'd encourage you, please either use an organic fertilizer where the risk of you burning your plants is much lower, just because the way that organic fertilizer functions is that it really incorporates into the soil and gives your plants nutrients over time, whereas a lot of synthetic fertilizers, maybe not all of them, but a lot of synthetic fertilizers are really just a big hit of nutrients all at the same time, kind of like a superfood smoothie or something like that, I don't know. There is a risk of your plant's roots burning just because they're like, oh my gosh, what's going on? So I believe you should always be watering your plants before, like thoroughly, before you fertilize or in tandem with your fertilizer. I do like to use worm castings, and there are a lot of organic fertilizers that I personally prefer, but basically just look at the package and follow the instructions to a T, or if anything, go a little bit less than what the instructions say, either in timing or in quantity. Now, there is sort of a debate as to whether or not you should be fertilizing your plants during the winter time. I personally do fertilize my plants during the winter time, but since I'm generally watering my plants less in the winter, it does balance out because you usually want to be watering your plants and fertilizing them at the same time. Yeah, as long as your plants are growing some and they're not completely dormant, I'd say it's probably fine to be fertilizing them, just because yes, they are using up those nutrients, just maybe not quite as often, because depending on where you live, growth does tend to slow down during the winter as those days shorten and they're just not getting nearly as much sun, and it's colder, and they're just like, okay, I'm gonna just hibernate for a little while. So the last thing on my list as something that I just didn't do well as a beginner plant parent was pruning, because I was very afraid of pruning. I was afraid of propagating. I was afraid of chopping up my plant because I didn't trust that it would grow back. A lot of the time when you chop your plant back, it grows back even fuller and even better. And I still sometimes have a hard time with this. And you don't have to just totally prune your plant and chop it up all the time. But if it's getting really leggy and you want to see if you can start over, don't be afraid to just chop and propagate that guy. Sometimes they grow back better than ever, and they're very grateful for it, especially if you are correcting the conditions. So say if you grew a plant in pretty low light and it's really leggy and has small leaves, if you chop it up and then put it in a much better space for it, it'll grow back a lot nicer than it was before. And then you've got lots of little babies too to work with, and maybe give them away, share them with friends. Also, a lot of the times pruning in general, even if it's just a little bit of scraggly things here and there, pruning can promote growth, which is pretty great. Oh, that's all that I have for this video. So I hope that you liked it. If you did enjoy it, please consider liking and subscribing and commenting and just generally engaging with the content, just because I would love to interact with you guys, meet you guys. This is a great community here. So I hope that you have a wonderful and blessed day. Bye-bye.